Hello, everyone. This is Jeff Halper from the Israeli Committee Against House Demolitions, here for my September 2024 update on what's happening in Palestine, Israel, the region, the world, and the genocide that's going on. And in some ways, I'm back to where I was in the August update, and that is that nothing seems to be happening. The Iranian Hezbollah attacks haven't taken place, and we're still locked into this hostage negotiations and the hostage thing, and is there going to be an agreement, and who's to blame, Netanyahu or Hamas, and all of that. But of course, that's all kind of the public cover for everything. What is in fact going on, and I guess my update has to do with the fact that it's disappeared. What is going on is the ongoing genocide in Gaza. I mean, nothing has stopped that. The Israeli army is still in Gaza. They don't want to be in Gaza. The Israeli army has said to the government, we've accomplished all our military objectives. Months ago, actually, we shouldn't really be here anymore. We're just creating more damage, more death, and so on, really for nothing in a way. But of course, the war is being perpetuated by Netanyahu himself because he knows that when the war ends, there'll be elections and he won't be elected again and all of that. We've talked about that before. But I think the fact that this genocide has really disappeared from our view is something noteworthy. It's that vacuum, it's that lack of news about a genocide that is actually what should be at the center of our attention. It's become background, and I think what's happened as well, and I think there's a kind of a racial undertone to this, is that the hostage issue has become the huge issue, which has deflected attention completely from the genocide of the Palestinians and the Palestinian struggle that's ongoing. So that, I've gotten in the last couple of weeks innumerable requests to be on TV, on radio interviews, and so on about what? About the huge demonstrations going on in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem around the hostage issue. That's become the news, and what's my opinion and what does it mean and so on. And what I'm trying to say is two things. First of all, in terms of those demonstrations, they have nothing to do whatsoever with Gaza. The vast majority of the people in those demonstrations support the Gaza invasion. They support the goals of the Israeli government. They support not only the destruction of Hamas, but they don't care about the genocide, the destruction, the death that's going on in Gaza, or even more so in the West Bank today. The West Bank has become Gazified. Tulkarm, the Jenin refugee camps, towns like Tubas in the north, now in the Hebron area. In other words, the reconquest, or not even more than that, the suppression of any Palestinian resistance, or even resistance in terms of farmers trying to resist violent settlers trying to throw them off their lands, is being repressed with a zero tolerance kind of a thing. None of these things are the issues of the demonstrations. Still 70% of the Israeli Jewish public support what Israel is doing in Gaza. Netanyahu is not unpopular because of the Gaza invasion, because of the genocide. Everything has boiled down to the hostage issue. Especially when the 6 hostages were executed and their bodies found and brought back, and that's what triggered the latest, round of protests. But all the focus of the world is on these 6 people. You know their names, you see them on TV, their families. The family of one of them addressed the Democratic National Convention when it was nominating Kamala Harris for president, at the same time that the thousands of Palestinian protesters outside, or pro-Palestinian protesters, pro-justice protesters were denied even 2 minutes to address the Democratic National Convention. So I think that, there is a racial undertone in the sense that, the predicament, the tragic predicament of these hostages, the 101 hostages that remain, who are white, who are Jewish, whose names we know, whose faces we know, whose families we hear from, are much, much more prominent in the news and in the discussion than the tens of thousands of Palestinians being killed in Gaza. I mean, the same day that the 6 bodies were found, Israel attacked a UN school, and about 40 Palestinians were killed, including a large number of children. That didn't make the news. That doesn't add up to the six hostages. And so I think, while our hearts go out to the hostages, I mean, these are innocent people as well that really had nothing to do except for the soldiers that are not hostages, that are part of that group that are in fact captives. Nevertheless, our hearts go out to the families and to the people being held themselves. Of course, no one should have to undergo that. But at the same time, we have to reflect on the fact that the whole discussion now revolves around these Israeli hostages and not around what's happening in Gaza itself. And I think our job, certainly as people who are concerned about justice for Palestinians and genocide and so on, and the repression that's going on, our job is to refocus attention from the hostages. I mean, not to nullify the issue of the hostages, but to balance, to redirect attention on what's happening in Gaza. I mean, a few months ago, there was a flurry of attention on Gaza. The ICJ made its ruling about plausible genocide. The ICJ also made another ruling that got less publicity, that the whole Israeli occupation is illegal. The ICC has issued a warrant, hasn't issued, has threatened to issue, it hasn't been decided yet, warrants of arrest for Netanyahu and Gallant. The UN General Assembly called for a ceasefire, and so on. In the last few months, there's nothing. And in that vacuum, there's almost like a normalization of a genocide. And in that vacuum, the hostage issue has captured our attention. So what we have to do, I think, is to refocus on Gaza. We have to ensure that the discussion of Gaza is front and center. And we have to push back against this idea in particular that Hamas is a terrorist group, and the whole language. We have to push back. Really, what we need to do collectively is to reframe the entire issue. In other words, right now, the Israeli framing is what captures the media and the public discourse, and that is that Israel is defending itself, just listen to Biden or Kamala Harris, against terrorists. And there's almost wall-to-wall agreement that Hamas is a terrorist organization. In fact, it is officially, in American and European law, it's designated as a terrorist organization. But this is a problem. We're not going to get into this whole discussion today, but this issue is that all non-state actors, all oppressed peoples that have a right to resist, their own oppression and colonization, and certainly their own erasure and genocide, they even have a right to resist in an armed struggle, are all then criminalized by states. In other words, the whole idea of state terrorism is something that we never talk about. That's completely out of the discussion. There's a very interesting researcher, he's died in the meantime, named R.J. Rummel, R-U-M-M-E-L, who still has a website that exists, who wrote a book called Death by Government, in which he says that over the whole course of the 20th century, about 170,000 innocent people, which is kind of the definition of terrorism. There is no international definition of terrorism, but the killing of innocent people, let's say, for political purposes, 170,000 innocent people were killed by what we would call terrorists. non-state actors over the course of the 20th century, which is a lot of people. But Rummel says, over the course of the 20th century, about 212 million innocent people were killed by states. You know, if we look at the Gaza-Israeli war, so-called, this isn't a war of two armies. Hamas does not have F-35s and American-supplied bunker buster bombs and a navy and artillery and an air force and sophisticated high-tech sensors and robotics and drones. They have none of that. So this is an asymmetric conflict, in that sense. But at the same time, it hides the state terrorism because Israel is not defending itself. Israel is in a process, as we all know, of colonizing Palestine. For the last 130 years, this was the point of Zionism. This was its very purpose, is to turn an Arab country into a Jewish country, to displace its population, to take its land, to erase the Palestinian cultural and historical presence in the country, and to completely invent and construct and impose a new country on the ruins of Palestine that's called Israel. So this is genocidal. Genocide is built into settler colonialism, like projects like Zionism. It's built, you can't transform somebody's country into your own country without genocide. And that has to be a part of our reframing. We have to say, wait a minute, this is not defense. This is a proactive attack by a genocidal colonial power on a people resisting their own erasure, and resisting colonization and fighting for their own fundamental rights. That has to be the framing. Now, it's true that sometimes non-state actors engage in terrorist actions. That's true, and that shouldn't happen. It's against international law, but that doesn't mean those groups themselves are terrorists. You know, terrorism is built into every kind of warfare. And so if we again take the wars of states, the terrorism that Israel has enacted on the Palestinians from the point of view of killing, you know, there's an article in Lancet, the British medical journal, that says probably it's not 40,000 or 42,000 or 43,000 Palestinians that have been killed in Gaza. The number is probably more like 186,000 people. If you take into account not only the people we know were killed, but people under the rubble, plus the diseases. Now polio is breaking out in Gaza, the diseases, the miscarriages, people dying of all the wounds. I mean, wounds are, there's tens of thousands of wounded people, but somehow they're not counted because you kind of assume, all right, a wounded person is going to get better. No, that's so the toll could be 186,000. And then add to the toll in the West Bank. And add to the fact that since 1948, Israel's demolished about 500,000 Palestinian homes and schools and mosques and businesses and wells and farms and infrastructure. So that the level of state terrorism that Israel has enacted on the Palestinians, not in defense, but in pursuit of its colonial takeover of Palestine, has to be a part of the discussion. We have to ensure that that becomes the thrust of the discussion. And in that context, Gaza becomes then, again, a central focal point. And the hostages, in a way, then become a minor issue. They're a minor issue. I mean, the hostage deal, of course, is interesting, and but in the bigger scheme of things, it's a marginal issue. It's a racial issue in that, again, it's privileging the white suffering and the white discourse. And in the end, the white Israeli framing of its colonial enterprise into simply defense of poor Jewish victims against terrorists, all of that is being served by the attention given to the hostage issue. And so I just want to, I think, in a way, that's my update of this month. The fact that we have to reflect on the fact that the genocide that's ongoing has disappeared from public attention, and all the public attention is now focused on the Israeli hostages. And what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of where our priorities are as people? And what does that mean in terms of our responsibility of bringing the focus back to Palestine and to Gaza and to Palestinian rights and to what Israel actually is, a colonial state? I'll leave you with those thoughts, and thanks for listening. See you next month.